It was Halloween night in 1984. Children dressed in their best costumes and went door to door, filling their buckets with candy and having the time of their lives. One mother, home alone with her daughter after returning from trick-or-treating, heard a knock at the door. She opened the door expecting to hear "trick or treat" from a princess or a superhero. Instead, she was met with a man in a wolf mask holding an 18-inch machete. The events that followed were so brutal and so unimaginable that even experienced detectives called it one of California's most horrific crimes. This Halloween, the big bad wolf wasn't part of a fairy tale. He was real, and his name was William Michael Dennis. The long-anticipated night of Halloween is supposed to be filled with laughter, candy, and make-believe scares. But on October 31st, 1984, that night became something else entirely for 31-year-old Doreen Erbert. 8 months pregnant and excited to welcome another child, Doreen was completely unaware that a real-life monster was coming to kill her. This is a story of heartbreak, obsession, and vengeance. A story where grief transformed into pure, cold, and calculated evil. Doreen Erbert was born as Doreen Hitchens in Santa Clara, California in 1952. A bright and passionate young woman, Doreen found herself drawn to the healthcare field, spurred by her kind nature and desire to help others. After graduating, Doreen began working in California's Bay Area as a physical therapist. During that time, she met a man by the name of William Michael Dennis. After only a few months of dating, Doreen and Dennis got married. About a year later, Doreen gave birth to a son whom they named Paul. Unfortunately, Doreen and Dennis divorced in 1977, only a year after their son was born. Doreen happened to meet a lovely and kind man, Charles Erbert, after her split from Dennis. Doreen and Charles got married, and in 1979, they welcomed their daughter, Dina. Paul primarily lived with Doreen, but stayed with his father on weekends. Dennis bought a house not far from where Doreen and Charles lived to stay closer to his son. Then, in February of 1980, everything changed. Doreen and Charles had a pool at their house, which they'd fenced in to keep the children safe. Tragically, in the few moments where Doreen had taken her eyes off Paul, the 3-year-old had managed to slip through the fence and fall into the pool. Paramedics responded, but the damage was done, and Paul died in the hospital a week later. Dennis was inconsolable following the death of his son. He blamed Doreen, as she was home at the time, for not being more responsible. Dennis attempted to seek damages in a wrongful death lawsuit against Doreen and Charles, but the jury ruled that this was a tragic accident and no one was to blame. With their shared custody agreement now gone, Doreen and Charles cut contact with Dennis following the trial. Meanwhile, Dennis continued to spiral deeper into grief that seemed inescapable. A few years later, Doreen and Charles had appropriately dealt with their grief and decided they were ready to expand their family. Tragically, Doreen suffered 2 miscarriages in their efforts to have another child. Finally, in 1984, the storm clouds cleared to reveal a rainbow. Doreen was pregnant with a healthy baby boy, due in early November. After so much pain and heartbreak, Charles and Doreen were overjoyed at the news and couldn't wait to welcome their son later that year. On October 31st, 1984, Doreen was nearly 9 months pregnant, her due date looming a mere few weeks away. Although she was about to give birth, Doreen wanted her 5-year-old daughter Dina to have a fun and memorable Halloween. While Charles stayed home to hand out candy, Doreen took Dina out trick-or-treating. When Doreen brought Dina back home, Charles let her know that they were nearly out of candy and that he needed to run to the store to buy more. He left the home a little after 9 p.m., assuring Doreen he'd be back within 20 minutes. Not long after Charles left, there was a knock at the door. Doreen went to answer it, likely assuming they'd had another eager trick-or-treater looking for candy. When Doreen opened the door, what stood before her was not a child in a costume. It was something far more sinister. A man, dressed in a wolf mask and holding an 18-inch machete, coldly said, "I'm going to kill you." Doreen first yelled at the man to leave, but her screams were ignored as the masked man entered the house. Fearing first for her daughter's safety, Doreen called to Dina to run and hide. Dina did as her mother instructed, hiding behind the couch in the living room. From her hiding place, the 5-year-old heard everything. Her mother's screams, followed by silence. Then came the sound of the man calling out to her. As he made his way through the house, the man yelled threats to Dina, saying that when he found her, he was going to kill her. Dina stayed silent and stayed hidden, and eventually the man gave up. Before he ran out the door, he yelled to Dina one last time, warning her that if she told anyone what she'd seen, he'd come back for her and kill her. A short time later, Charles arrived back home. He'd only been gone for 15 minutes. When he approached the front door of his home, he noted that it was left unlocked. Immediately upon entering, Charles was met with a scene so brutal and so unimaginable, it's difficult to put into words. There was blood everywhere, on the floor, the walls, and even on the ceiling. There was so much blood in the floor that Charles actually slipped on it. Doreen was lying near the entryway, soaked in blood, and slashed repeatedly all over her body. Charles ran to his wife, desperate to help her in any way that he could. He called 911 and ran to find Dina, still hiding behind the couch. The only words the terrified young girl could muster were about the big bad wolf who came into their home and attacked her mommy. When first responders arrived on scene, they found Doreen still lying in the floor with a pulse so weak it was almost non-existent. Charles was covered in blood and absolutely hysterical. He insisted he had been all but lying on Doreen, trying to put as much pressure on her wounds as possible, but naturally, police looked to him as the first suspect. Near where Doreen was found were slash marks in the ceiling, as if someone had raised a sharp weapon overhead and brought it down. Outside the front door, police found a wolf mask and a trail of blood that led to a point down the street and then vanished entirely, as if someone had gotten into a vehicle. In addition to Doreen's multiple deep slashes, her left hand had been severed entirely. When they found Doreen's hand, they found something even more horrific. The body of her unborn son, hacked into pieces and lying in the floor next to Doreen's severed hand. Doreen was immediately transported to the nearest hospital, but she had already lost too much blood and died in the ambulance. 2 innocent lives were lost in a gruesome display of violence, and all that was left behind was a dead-end blood trail and a wolf mask that is the stuff of absolute nightmares. Though police were initially suspicious of Charles, his story checked out immediately. He had receipts from the stores he'd been to, and store employees confirmed seeing him during the exact window when Doreen had been attacked and murdered. Multiple witnesses also confirmed seeing a man in a wolf mask with a machete outside the Erbert home, including during the time neighbors had seen Charles leave. Police acted quickly to eliminate Charles as a suspect and turned their attention to who may have wanted to hurt Doreen. Pretty quickly, investigators landed on a name: Doreen's ex-husband, William Michael Dennis. Dennis still lived nearby, so officers and detectives quickly made their way to his home. His truck was in the driveway, and an officer who glanced into his window noted blood on the steering wheel and gear shift. There was a light on inside the house, and police knocked on the door multiple times with no answer. They had dispatch call the house, and Dennis answered the phone. He was asked to open the door for the officers. Suddenly, the light switched off, and officers heard the sound of water running inside. Finally, Dennis came to the door dressed in a robe. When the officers told him what had happened to Doreen, he seemed not to be affected by the news, and invited the officers inside to discuss it further. Dennis consented to a search of his home, and when they asked him to sign the paperwork, he clumsily attempted to sign with his left hand. He had kept his right hand firmly in his pocket, and when the investigators saw why, their suspicions only grew. Dennis had a bandage wrapped around his right hand, and there was blood soaking through the wrapping. He claimed it was the result of a kitchen mishap while carving a pumpkin, but the detectives believed he'd been carving something else entirely. As the search began, Dennis was asked for his ID, which he said was in his bedroom upstairs. The officer that accompanied him upstairs to retrieve his ID was overcome with a gut feeling that something was wrong. As Dennis made his way towards the head of the bed, the officer ordered him to freeze. Tucked away behind the bed's headboard was a loaded shotgun. Inside the house, police recovered multiple bloodied articles of clothing and noted fresh bloodstains throughout the house. Far more blood than what could have ever come from a small accident in the kitchen. They took Dennis into custody, but after 48 hours, he was released due to lack of physical evidence. A few days later, the physical evidence they needed finally came. Though forensic science was only beginning to progress, and DNA was not yet an available technology, blood samples taken from the scene were tested and found to match Dennis's blood type. The nail in the coffin was photographs obtained from a Halloween party the year prior, in which Dennis can be seen wearing the exact same mask found outside the Erbert family's front door. The evidence was all there, and Dennis was charged with the murder of Doreen Erbert. He stood trial, and despite attempts from his defense attorney to plead insanity, the court found Dennis guilty as charged. Due to a provision in California's law for special circumstances in the case of murders involving pregnant women, Dennis was sentenced to death for murdering both Doreen and her unborn son. The Big Bad Wolf, as Gina had called him, would await his execution behind bars. Since Dennis was convicted in 1988, there have been numerous attempts at appeals. His original defense attorney attempted to convince the jury to lessen his sentence, even though he entered a guilty plea, by demonstrating that Dennis was not mentally sane. The defense called expert testimony from Dr. Benson, a psychiatrist who had seen Dennis prior to the murders. Dr. Benson claimed that Dennis had spiraled into delusion after Paul's death, and that he blamed Doreen for what he saw as murdering his only child. During the testimony, it was revealed that Dennis had shared his plan to take revenge on Doreen and Charles by putting them in body bags, locking them in boxes, and dumping them in the San Francisco Bay. Dr. Benson said he believed this to be purely fantasy, the ravings of an angry and grief-stricken father. This testimony only worked against the defense when the prosecution revealed what else they had found inside Dennis's home. In his workshop, detectives found 2 homemade wooden boxes with locks installed, hand-stitched body bags, anchors, and a map of the San Francisco Bay. To make matters worse, the boxes and bags were perfectly sized to the heights of both Doreen and Charles, and Dennis even owned a boat. What the defense had intended to be expert testimony proving Dennis was not sane backfired in a big way. This proved that Dennis had premeditated murdering Doreen to an extreme. Halloween invites us all to face our fears, but we feel safe doing so because we know it's all for fun. But sometimes, the scariest monsters aren't those in the stories we tell by flashlight at night. They are people we know in real life. Doreen Erbert, a woman who had already suffered plenty in her life, was brutally and tragically murdered because her ex-husband could not accept that accidents can happen and there's not always someone to blame. Doreen's unborn son, only a few weeks from making his arrival in the world, had his life cut short before it could even really begin. Though justice was technically served and William Michael Dennis remains on death row, there is no justice that feels right in light of such evil. The tragic and evil murder of Doreen Erbert is a chilling story that still haunts us all, and her story shall remain as yet another tale from the underworld.
If you enjoyed this true crime story, don't forget to like and subscribe and let us know what you think in the comments. Want to watch another chilling tale from the underworld? Check out these other videos on screen.